an executive committee woman from Senate District 1, and I am on the Texas Ed 911 panel. And
hi. Hi, I'm Monica Leal Cline. I'm also on the Texas Ed 911 panel, and I'm the founder of It Takes a Family.
Hey, I'm Lee Spiller with Citizens Commission on Human Rights, Texas, and I'm also on the Texas Ed 911 panel, and that's the deal.
Yeah. So Melissa Beckett is not with us this morning. She has some meetings in Austin, and so we're going to just continue without her, although I know she'll be, I miss having her here. So, but there's always a lot to talk about in education in Texas. And so why don't we start with you, Lee, because we haven't talked a whole lot, I think, yet about mental health. And yet we know mental health in schools is going to be a big issue this session. We're seeing lots of bills being filed. And
yeah, it's quite interesting because while we haven't formally talked about mental health, it seems like every live stream, it ends up coming back to that, whether it starts out with gender issues or books or whatever, it always circles back to mental health because that's kind of central. It's sort of the vehicle, right? And the problem that we've had in Texas is that in 2019, a couple of laws were passed creating something called a multi-tiered systems of support. And nobody knew what that was. There were parents who were very concerned about the possibility of children being mental health screened without parental consent. And the bill authors and even me, we're like, no, where does it say that in the bill? And we have multiple sections of law in both the education and the family codes that require parental consent. Everybody who told these people that they were reading something into the bill, we were all wrong because there was a line about multi-tiered systems of support, but nobody knew what that was. Now we see, and it's one of the things that's in the Texas Ed 911 presentation, is you have this whole laundry list of universal services, everything from mental health awareness and education to teaching children to self-refer for services independently of their parents. And that oozes into the textbooks. So the health textbook that the SBOE approved for high school kids, for example, has a section informing kids that they can consent for certain things and that at 16 they can consent for inpatient or outpatient psychiatric hospital care. And one of the things that they should do is call a hospital and find out if that hospital allows them to seek care on their own, independently of parents. That's dangerous. And then it goes on from there.
And I think that really ties into what the World Health Organization and the CDC are trying to do with their agenda, which I think we should talk about in a minute, Monica, but going back to multi-tiered systems of support, these are things that sound so good in education, and then there's some necessity to these things as well. But then what happens is then they end up being abused. And what we see is from a special education perspective, multi-tiered systems of support are there to really prevent all students from going into special education when they don't need it, which would be restrictive. And so we want to be very careful to not, to only have kids in special education who need that and qualify for it. And so then, but instead what we see happen is these multi-tiered systems of support are implemented in place of an evaluation or child find law, which, is part of the school's responsibility to identify students who have difficulty learning and need to be evaluated. It sort of bypasses that and replaces some other duties that are required of them. And then, as we've talked about before, the nice thing about when we do go through an evaluation process, instead of these multi-tiered support systems, it requires parental notification. There's all these procedural safeguards that have to take place. And so that's sort of, I think, what I think of is that it's just abused.
That's our view as well. And I think that multi-tiered systems of support from a special ed perspective is one thing, but what we've done in Texas is kind of taken that over for the behavioral components more so.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would say that that with the behavioral, if you have a child or there's a student who has behavior issues that interfere with their ability to learn, that warrants evaluation, because school programs traditionally are designed so that typically developing children can go into that environment, and they may have some minor, behavior issues that can be corrected through classroom management. But if it's literally interfering with their learning so that there has to be this intervention, heavy intervention, then it warrants special education evaluation.
Correct. And at that point, you've triggered all the procedural safeguards.
Mm-hmm.
And in Texas, between what we're doing as multi-tiered systems of support and threat assessment, it's almost like we're acknowledging that, a child has a problem that is bad enough that it is interfering with one of their major life domains like education, but we're then not following up and applying the safeguards so that the parents are involved.
Mm-hmm. And then all of this self-referring and taking the parent out of it. What does that greater agenda what does that look like, Monica?
I wanted to mention that is when you talked about parents, being able to provide consent for these services. There's a big difference between how Child Find, the way you've explained it, Christin, and I've learned that from you, is that it is a real informed consent from a parent. This is not just a paper that's sent to home and among other papers, and you sign it, with everything else and send it in. No, this is a concerted effort. You have to really make decisions. There is a meeting. I mean, this is real informed parental consent. Parents truly understand what it means for their child to become part of the Child Find program and get services, versus some of these programs, as Lee's talking about, where there's this blanket consent. Parents are consenting and almost unaware of that consent. They're unaware of what's actually happening. They're unaware of what kind of mental health or behavioral interventions are being placed onto their children. They're unaware that their children are being encouraged to go and self-refer, whether it's in mental health or even for, SUDs and family planning and all kinds of other things. Mm-hmm. And as you're mentioning this, it makes me think about this article. I don't know if y'all had a chance to read it. I texted it to y'all last night from the Texas Tribune, and it's talking about our Commissioner of Education, Mike Morath, and they're talking about finances in the schools. And, and he's admitting that there is a huge mass exodus of children from schools during COVID, and that it continues to decrease. So he's acknowledging that. Currently, schools are receiving money based on attendance, not on enrollment. And so that also, they talked about how the advantage of getting money, getting funding based on enrollment versus attendance. That way, even if a kid's not there, the school's still getting money. And then they talked about special education just a little bit, because they talked about how they get more money for special education. Any child who's in special education gets more, the school will get more money. So they specifically talked about bilingual students, or really just the influx of children who are coming across the border, who are attending our schools and are needing bilingual education as well. And so they get more money for those children. And so they started talking. And so it made me wonder, Christin, when you talk about Child Find, does Child Find trigger any kind of special education?
It does.
Okay.
It does. Well, it doesn't. Yeah, I guess it would. trigger some, but really what the point of child fine law is in federal law is that it basically says that a school district has the duty and obligation to identify students who have disabilities that are interfering with their learning. And yeah, so
that would be very specific. So you wouldn't say that majority of the children are going to need child fine.
No, they're not. No, they wouldn't meet. No, and when we talk about, there's a lot of in special education. There's a lot of barriers to over identifying students, and we rarely see students over identified. And really, we've had the opposite problem in the state of Texas. And the state of Texas illegally put caps on how many students could be identified for special education. And that was, I believe, later repealed, or they were found that was, that did not comport to federal law. And so there was a big lawsuit in Texas over that. Because you can't cap how many students are going to qualify for special education. You don't know how many students are going to qualify.
But from what you're describing from child find, it's such an aggressive or thorough process that not just anyone gets a part of child find. My point is that what Lee's talking about with the multi-tiered system of support, they are being able to capture all students.
Yes.
All students are needing this services. So now all students need this. Therefore, we need more funding. My point is this is about money, and our children are part of this market. They are dollar signs. Right. And so that's what I'm finding with this, but not just that. And I think you were alluding to this earlier, is that what is going on in our schools with like the whole school, whole community, whole child program. And now what I'm discovering is communities in schools within our schools, which is a nonprofit organization. And so what we're finding now is that as we're recognizing, and even teachers are saying, we're overwhelmed with social emotional learning, mental health programs, in comes communities in schools, which will provide all of those services. And they're not employees of the district, although they do get a lot of money from the TEA, from the federal government or state money. And to be part of a district, then the district has to pay them. I know in Fredericksburg, they were about to pay them $93,000 until parents started to complain about the program. And honestly, parents didn't even complain about communities in schools at first. We were asking questions, and that wasn't enough to make communities in schools really nervous, and they backed out. But all we did was ask questions based on their programs. And so my whole point in this is that they're really wanting to increase their funding in any way possible. And what we're seeing are that these multi-tiered systems of support, or these behavioral interventions, are, when you look at the programs, they look more like re-education camps. They are deconstructing our children. They're deconstructing all of the values that their families have taught them. Lee talks about this during our TexEd 911 panel on the history of psychology. And we'll have Lee talk about that, because I don't know that we've talked about that on the live stream. But when they deconstruct our children of all the values that we have taught them at home, then they re-educate them with a new ideology. And what we're seeing with communities in schools is that includes diversity, equity, and inclusion, which really means that they are speaking, they're basically saying that all white children, all white adults are part of a white supremacy group, that they're all just instinctually oppressive people, that they just innately are privileged, and that they need to denounce that and become accomplices and allies in this, this world of, I don't know, submitting to the people of color who are eternal victims, which is ridiculous. And what it's really doing is creating all this division among our children. And I've said this before, is that when we can do this to children and to whole populations, to get them to a position where they don't believe they have value, or that they're always seen as something devalued, then those people will have mental health issues. Those people will be vulnerable, and vulnerable people are easy to control. And I believe that's really a big piece of this, is to easily control our children who will be the next generation of leaders. But Lee, I would love for you to share with us what you've shared on the panel about education and deconstructing our kids.
Sure. Yeah. And there's actually a very good book on it called The Leipzig Connection. Leipzig is Leipzig, Germany. And the father of modern psychology was there. And he was the one that really changed that profession and adopted the viewpoint that no, man is not a spiritual thing. Man doesn't have a soul. So basically, we're animals. And then a student of his came back to the US and then influenced some of the icons of American education, like, John Dewey, Eddie Lee Thorndike. And all of a sudden you started seeing these teachers' colleges and child development centers. And this was the progressive education movement. And that's actually one of the earliest instances where I hear about the whole child is somewhere, and I can't remember whether it was Dewey or Thorndike, but it was, it was in that era of the early 1900s. And then, by the 40s, you've got G. Brock Chisholm, who was a psychiatrist, and J.R. Reese, another psychiatrist, and they co-founded the World Federation for Mental Health. And actually, Brock Chisholm was the original head of the World Health Organization. And they were operating on the basis that what's wrong is this concept of right and wrong. It's making people neurotic. And so they wanted to split children off from their parents' values, from their church beliefs, all of that. So by 1973, you've got, what was his name? Chester M. Pierce. He was a psychiatrist addressing the, it was like an international childhood education conference or international child conference. But anyway, he pointed out that every child coming to school at the age of 5 is sick or insane because he has allegiances to our founding fathers, towards his parents, towards his supernatural being, towards the sovereignty of this nation individually, and that it was up to teachers to make all these sick children well by creating the international child of the future. So what you had is these increasing encroachments on families, their values, their religious beliefs. And, that has continued to the point where today we have social and emotional learning, which is all about values, attitudes, beliefs, and behavior. And it's sold to schools as character education and what a great thing. But when you really look at it, for thousands of years, we depended on manners, morals, etiquette, discipline. And now we're depending on psychology.
And I think it just demonstrates how radicalized education has become. And really we're seeing how radicalized other elements of our culture have become, and so many of us don't like it, even though, even those who are not necessarily ever been politically engaged, they're starting to see it. They're seeing it on the Grammys, they're seeing it at the Super Bowl, and they don't like it. And yet our schools have become so radicalized, and now it's right there out in the open, and they still have to put a really, pretty name on it, which is social emotional learning, because that sounds wonderful. Who wouldn't want, who wouldn't like, that title? But what it is very, it's based in radical theory, and and it's crazy. I mean, and I think there's a lot of people who would listen or tune into this and think, this sounds like conspiracy stuff, but it's right there in black and white if you look at the history of it.
I look at the term transformative social and emotional learning. That's not something people made up. It was social and emotional learning as social change and activism, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Well, that, again, people didn't make that up. That came from a paper. I believe it was published in 2019. And it changed the SEL, in my opinion, was already bad because it was delving too much into people's values.
Mhm.
instead of the common agreements that we might have as a community, right? Like, school should probably reflect the values of the community. And instead, it kind of changed that around to where schools are promoting a particular set of values. But then with the transformative SEL, then you had the activism component. And I'll never forget, my grandson went to a school in Austin, and it was it's one of the artsy ones. I forget the name of it. It's a middle school. And there was a teacher who got really ugly with a couple of Hispanic kids. And, because they were speaking Spanish. And he said something about, if you want to speak Spanish, go back to Mexico. Well, that was wrong, no doubt. But you had other faculty who helped the children stage a protest, scheduled it. And my grandson, thank goodness, he decided he was going to sit that one out. But, this was done as kind of a lesson in civil disobedience. Well, it got out of control. Windows were broken. Things were vandalized. Wow. Yeah, the police had to come.
Yeah, I think that what we've seen in schools is this shift from charity, from developing charity and kids and engaging in the community through charity, to social justice.
Yes.
And we saw a real shift, I believe, even in our credentialing programs, where back probably about 10, 15, maybe 20 years ago, but I would say really 10 years ago, the credentialing program started to become very radicalized in social justice theory. And it was, I remember, I was getting my teaching credential about a decade ago, a little over. And I remember that now, and now we're seeing it play out. But the problem is that activism is not healthy for children. We know this. There's research that demonstrates that. Activism is these are issues that are very heavy topics that adults can engage in, process, that children have a much harder time processing. Activism, but what develops children really well is charity, because it's about doing good for the community. So that's a great example, Lee, of social justice, and how it gets out of control and very quickly.
And we all know that there's injustices. There's no doubt about that. But, I remember when we were in school, we would learn about the civil rights movement, but that didn't mean that we practiced it. Right.
Right. And I wanted to mention that as well, is like, your example is that the children were moved towards what we know of today as a social justice movement, which is the activism, the violence, the destruction of property. So those children didn't learn how to communicate effectively. They didn't learn how to confront a racist or prejudiced viewpoint in a way that was constructive. And I don't know if on the video, a lot of times people say, "Oh, your panel is all white." I'm like, no, I'm Hispanic. I grew up in a predominantly Hispanic community. I'm from Brownsville, Texas, and I do want to share this story because I don't want people to misunderstand that when we're faced with prejudice, that we are not to take action, or that I am to, I don't want people to misunderstand what Christin said about being charitable. If I'm faced with prejudice, I'm not going to provide charity to the person who did that to me. And my parents taught me about racism, and they taught me based on their experience in Brownsville, Texas, predominantly Hispanic community, but there was a lot of racism, and especially for people who were darker complected. So my mother is very indigenous. I'm darker complected than my father. And so they really wanted to prepare me for any injustice or prejudice that I might face. But they didn't teach it to me in such a way that I was to hate people or to harbor bitterness. Instead, they taught me how to confront it and how to do it constructively. And so one year I had a math class, and it did happen to be a white male teacher. And he let me and the rest of the students know that he understood that Mexicans were stupid. He said that we didn't understand math and that he didn't expect us to. He said that that he was going to pass us anyway, and that we would enjoy this class, but that we wouldn't have to be challenged by learning math. And so when he started teaching math, like a word problem, and I'll never forget, at least some of the word problem was about a little girl who bought all these or grew apples, I don't know, and then she was going to sell them. And so it was this word problem about selling apples. But anyway, instead of teaching us math, he said, well, why do you think this little girl had that many apples? And why do you think she was selling them? And now I look back and I think, was that still emotional learning? Was he like,
Wow.
decided not to teach us math, and we were to then now just think of this story about this little girl? My parents taught me to be constructive. And so I didn't stand up in class and make a scene, but I did look around and I saw all of my, friends with their heads down, and they were so ashamed because they were being treated that way. And I couldn't help but think that many of them believed what this teacher was saying. I told my parents about it, and they encouraged me to go to the leadership of the school, which I did. And I confidently and professionally, as a high schooler, stated my case and was asked to be removed from that classroom. I wanted the teacher to be observed, and I wanted to be removed from his classroom to another teacher that I knew was considered kind of like the best of all math teachers, who happened to be Hispanic, actually. And so I got moved to another class. I enjoyed math so much that I chose to go to summer school to advance in math, which is, I was being a real dork there, but I was so moved by this. Now, I didn't stage a protest. I did not break windows. I did not believe that I was an eternal victim. I did not believe that all white people were oppressive. I believed that that man had a problem and he needed to be corrected. And that is the difference. My parents taught me how to be strong, to know good from evil, and to face evil head on in a constructive way and to overcome it, but not to overcome it by pushing white people below me or other people below me, or by, creating all kinds of problems in our society. I was expected to be a productive citizen. That's what my parents were raising me to be, a productive adult who had to face issues. And that's what our kids need. But I think the point of this too is that it's parents who need to engage with their children. A school cannot teach a child to do those kind of things, but a parent can. And so I always end with that, is that how important the family is and how important it is for families to be engaged. But this social justice movement, Christin, that you mentioned, is at the core of communities and schools. And they are part of our Texas Education Agency now. They are self-professed the largest behavioral health organization providing behavioral health interventions in the state of Texas in our schools.
Yeah, and they're actually written into Texas Education Code.
Exactly. They're in our code, and they are committed to social justice movements and teaching our children to be activists rather than lifting up all children to be productive citizens of this country. And they, in their book, have said that they want to institutionalize their model in every education agency. So their sites are not right now, they're just going to individual districts. But in West Virginia, they were able to provide licensing to the West Virginia Department of Education with the communities and schools model, and the entire education system in West Virginia is led by the philosophy, the ideology of communities and schools, which is social justice. And their hope is to institutionalize that ideology in every department of education in every state, so that they no longer have site coordinators, but that every administrator and every teacher is following the social justice movement in the Department of Education.
Mhm.
Wow.
And I would just add that what everyone needs to really understand, I think big picture wise, is that this is radical. It's radicalized. It is and it is one point of view. It is a point of view ultimately that does create victims, and victims are also, it creates entitlement, and that's the ultimate goal of this movement. And so when I say charity was used to be taught in schools, charity is mostly really, really appropriate for our younger students, like elementary age. It's appropriate at all ages, but it's something that we focused on a lot in elementary schools in the past. Now, social justice activism is being taught in elementary schools, whereas civic engagement, debate, all those things have always been taught, but not from this radicalized perspective. And I think that's, what everyone has to understand and take from this, even if you don't delve really deeply into education issues, just understand that it's a very radicalized viewpoint and what they're teaching our children.
Right. And this doesn't mean, this started off as a conversation on mental health. This doesn't mean that every mental health person is bad. Some of our best friends and allies have been psychologists, but unfortunately, it can also be used as a tool. And that's the concerning thing is these programs appear to do that.
Well, and these programs are doing, and I think this goes back to the first deceit that we ever saw in the Bible, is taking a little bit of truth and then twisting it and turning it into something it was never meant to be. And so what we see with some of these programs, including communities in schools, is that, are they feeding children who are hungry? Yes. Are they providing clothing to children who need clothing? Yes. Are they linking kids and families with resources in the community that they need? Yes. And they're also indoctrinating your children. And they're also, they're also telling our children that being heterosexual is not normal. They're telling our children not to practice heteronormativity, not to believe that gender is binary, but instead they present them with all kinds of, hundreds of genders that they can follow, along with the flags associated with that. And so that's the problem, is that they come in with a little bit of good, and then they just blanket the children with ideologies that are harmful to them, and goes against family values. And what's sad is that they're so close to being able to institutionalize that in our departments of education, because they've already done it in West Virginia.
And what parents need to understand is that when you hand over your responsibility, what's really your responsibility, to take your child to the dentist, take your child to the doctor, take your child to get any sort of help to get through, any sort of emotional crisis that's going on. When you hand that responsibility over to the government, you hand over the control. You no longer have control in that anymore. Now you're partnering with the government, and you are giving the government, you are consenting to the government having a say in what should really be 100% your say and your responsibility. And unfortunately, we have too many parents who are willing to do that because they want the handout. They want the handout. And some of these parents are driving expensive cars, shopping and buying expensive purses and handbags. But they want the handout. They want the help, but there is a price to pay for that. And
don't forget, some parents are just desperate, right?
Well, some are, and there are some who can't, they're enticed by it because they truly don't have the money to, to get some of the services that the school wants to provide. And so, but there should be safeguards in our laws for all parents. but I think my warning, and I tell this to clients who go through special education and there's services available called education related mental health service or educationally related mental health services. It's always better to provide it privately. And that's what I tell parents. If you want to have the most say, provide it privately. Get it privately. Don't invite them into your lives. Don't invite the government into your lives.
Yeah, be the leader in whatever it is that you're seeking. You have to lead that for your child. Don't let the government, don't let the teacher, don't let the school lead that, but you as the parent lead that. And you need to realize that when you go to the CDC's website and you look up whole school, whole community, whole child, you will see that and this is why communities and schools fit so well into their model, is that they truly believe that the child who is at the center of their diagram, you're going to see their diagram, and it's like a big circle. The child is in the center, and then there's community resources all around them. And the family is considered just one small little tool in that. The family is not seen as the primary provider or authority over the child. This program believes that they're just a tiny little thing, and really you just better cooperate with all the other things that are being provided to your child. They don't see you as the center at all, and we need to move against that. We need to fight against that, because parents, we are the stewards over our children. And I know Bernadette Broyles from Child and Parental Rights campaign. She's in a new film called Dysphoria that I don't know when it's going to come out, but in the trailer, I just cannot get her quote out of my mind. And she basically says, "Whoever wants the children the most will have them." Whoa. And so parents, do you want your child more than the government? Do you want your child more than the teachers? Do you want your child more than communities and schools? Because you need to want your child more in order to save them. And that's really the crux of this, is being able to strengthen our families. And it doesn't matter if you are in poverty or if you are wealthy. I grew up in poverty, and my parents still were the authority over me.
Right.
Poverty does not mean that a child doesn't need the authority and help and protection of their parent. And I was able to overcome many things because of how my parents raised me, regardless of how much money was in the bank. And so it doesn't matter what your situation is. You were the authority over that child. You are to raise them. You are to empower them. It is you. I mean, we see even the story of Ben Carson. His mother was illiterate and uneducated. He didn't know that growing up because she constantly pushed him to learn and to read. And education meant everything to her. And she learned to read it as an adult. So it doesn't matter what your situation is. Do not let anyone, communities and schools, the school, I don't care who it is, tell you that you're not able to raise and empower and protect your own child, because you can.
That's right.
Yeah. I think that's a good place for us to end.
Yep. Yeah, that was great. That's the way I see it too.
Yeah.
Thank you, Christin, for leading us today.
Oh,
yes.
Thank y'all. It's so good to be with y'all. And we'll see each other next Monday. And again, at 9:30 every Monday morning, we have this roundtable discussion. So thank y'all. Have a great week, and we will see y'all next week.
Bye. God bless.
Bye-bye.